The taxi dropped me off in front of my house at 2 a.m., 3 months after I'd left for my recovery trip through Europe. I hadn't told David I was coming home early. Something about my son's recent phone conversations had felt off, evasive in ways that made me want to see our household dynamics without advance warning. The stroke 6 months ago had changed everything. One moment I was reviewing property contracts in my home office. The next I was waking up in a hospital bed with my left side partially paralyzed and my speech slurred beyond recognition. The doctors said I was lucky. Many people my age didn't survive strokes as severe as mine, and those who did often faced permanent disability that would require full-time care. But I'd had Kasia. My daughter-in-law had moved into my house the day I came home from the hospital, sleeping in the guest room next to mine so she could help me navigate basic tasks that had become monumentally difficult. Feeding myself, getting dressed, walking to the bathroom without falling. Kasia had patiently assisted with everything while working her 2 part-time jobs to keep money coming in. David had been helpful too, of course, but in the distracted way of someone managing a crisis rather than providing care. He'd handled the medical appointments and insurance paperwork, while Kasia handled the intimate, exhausting daily work of helping me rebuild basic functions. When my doctor suggested that travel might aid my recovery, new environments to challenge my healing brain, David had enthusiastically supported the idea. Mom, you should take as long as you need in Europe. Kasia and I will handle everything here. Now, standing in my driveway with my luggage, I realized how quiet the house looked. No lights in the main windows, no signs of activity that suggested my son and daughter-in-law were living comfortable lives in my absence. I let myself in with my key, noting immediately that the living room felt different, emptier somehow, as if furniture had been rearranged or removed. The house carried the slightly stale air of a place that hadn't been properly maintained, despite the fact that I'd left clear instructions about utilities, maintenance, and household upkeep. David? Kasia? I called softly, not wanting to startle them if they were sleeping. No response from upstairs, where their bedroom was located. But I heard a rustling sound from somewhere else in the house, a quiet movement that seemed to come from the direction of the garage. I walked through the kitchen toward the door that led to our attached garage, confused about why anyone would be in that space at 2 a.m. The garage housed my car, some storage shelves, and the washer and dryer, but nothing that would require middle-of-the-night attention. When I opened the door and turned on the light, I found Kasia sleeping on a thin camping mattress on the concrete floor, covered by a single blanket that looked inadequate for the October chill. Her few belongings were organized neatly in a corner, clothes folded in small piles, toiletries arranged on a cardboard box that served as a makeshift dresser. "Kasia," I whispered, shocked by the sight of my daughter-in-law sleeping in conditions that belonged in a homeless shelter, not in the home of someone who owned multiple properties. She woke immediately, the kind of alert awakening that suggested she'd become accustomed to being startled awake. When she saw me, her face shifted through confusion, recognition, and what looked like shame. "Victoria, you are home early. I am sorry, I was just..." She gestured vaguely at her makeshift sleeping arrangement, as if trying to explain why she was living like a refugee in my garage. "Kasia, what are you doing sleeping out here? Where's David?" "David is upstairs in your bedroom. He said I make too much noise and complaints, so better for everyone if I sleep here." I felt something cold settle in my chest as I processed what Kasia was telling me. During my 3-month absence, my son had apparently decided that his wife, who had cared for me through the most vulnerable period of my life, deserved to sleep on a concrete floor while he enjoyed the comfort of my master bedroom. "How long have you been sleeping in the garage?" "Since maybe 6 weeks after you left for Europe. David said the guest room should be kept nice for when you return, and that main bedroom is more comfortable for him." "And you agreed to this arrangement?" Kasia's expression suggested that her agreement hadn't been particularly relevant to David's decision. "I work early shift at coffee shop and late shift at restaurant. David said my schedule disrupts his sleep, so better for marriage if I sleep separate." I looked around the garage, noting the strategic placement of her belongings that suggested she'd been living here for more than just a few nights. A small lamp for reading, a plastic container that probably held snacks, clothes hanging from a makeshift line strung between storage shelves. This wasn't a temporary arrangement. This was how my daughter-in-law had been living for over a month. "Where's David now?" "Sleeping in your bed. He said since you are gone, someone should use good bedroom instead of waste it." I walked back through the house to my bedroom, where I found David sprawled across my king-sized bed, surrounded by empty food containers and what appeared to be several days' worth of laundry. The room smelled like someone who'd been living without much consideration for cleanliness or respect for other people's property. David. My son woke slowly, the heavy awakening of someone who'd been drinking or staying up too late. When he focused on me standing in the doorway, his expression shifted from confusion to mild annoyance. Mom, you're supposed to be in Europe for another month. I decided to come home early. David, why is Kasia sleeping in the garage? David sat up and stretched, apparently not registering any urgency about the situation I'd discovered. Kasia's been complaining a lot lately and creating drama. I figured it would be better for everyone if she had her own space where she couldn't bother anyone. You figured it would be better to make your wife sleep on a concrete floor? It's not that dramatic, Mom. She has a mattress and blankets, and honestly, she works weird hours anyway, so it makes more sense for her to sleep separately. I stared at my son, this 32-year-old man who was casually explaining why he'd relegated his wife to garage sleeping as if it were a reasonable household management decision. David, get out of my bed and get dressed. We need to have a conversation about what's been happening in this house while I was away. Mom, you look tired from traveling. Maybe we should discuss this tomorrow when everyone's more rested. No, David, we're discussing this right now. And then, you're going to explain to me why you think treating Kasia like an unwelcome house guest is appropriate behavior for a married man living in his mother's house. As David reluctantly got up to get dressed, I realized that my 3 months in Europe had given me more than physical recovery from my stroke. They'd given me clarity about family dynamics that I'd been too vulnerable to address during my immediate recovery period. My son had taken advantage of my absence and Kasia's gentle nature to create a household hierarchy that reflected his sense of entitlement rather than basic human decency. But David didn't know that his mother's recovery had included more than just physical therapy. I'd spent 3 months thinking about inheritance, family loyalty, and what people deserved based on their actions rather than their accidents of birth. Some lessons about character were about to be taught with consequences that would reshape our family permanently. And some sons were about to discover that underestimating their mother's determination was a mistake that could cost them everything they'd assumed they would inherit. I spent the rest of that sleepless night sitting in my living room, thinking about the 18 months since my stroke and how differently David and Kasia had responded to my vulnerability. While I'd been in Europe focusing on my physical recovery, I'd also been reflecting on family relationships with the clarity that comes from distance and time. When the sun came up, I found Kasia in the kitchen making coffee with the careful quietness of someone accustomed to not disturbing others. She was already dressed for her morning shift at the coffee shop, her movements efficient, but tired in ways that suggested months of inadequate sleep. Good morning, Victoria. I am sorry you found me in garage last night. I should have explained situation better. Kasia, you have nothing to apologize for. I'm the one who should be apologizing for not knowing what was happening in my own house. She looked surprised by my response, apparently having expected criticism rather than support. David said you might be upset about arrangement, but that you would understand once you heard full story. What's David's version of the full story? Kasia sat down across from me with her coffee, her expression suggesting uncertainty about whether she should be honest about my son's behavior. David said that while you were sick, I became too, presumptuous, that I acted like I belonged in family instead of remembering my place as foreign daughter-in-law. I felt anger building in my chest as I realized that David had been rewriting the history of my recovery to justify treating Kasia poorly. Kasia, what exactly did you do that David considered presumptuous? I think maybe I was too comfortable during your recovery time. I slept in guest room to help with your night medications. I used kitchen to cook foods you could eat easily. I answered phone calls from doctors and physical therapists when you were too tired to talk. You mean you provided excellent care when I needed it most? David said that after you left for Europe, I should remember that this is his family home where I am guest, and that I need to be more respectful of boundaries. I realized that David had systematically undermined Kasia's confidence and sense of belonging during my absence, using my recovery period against her as evidence that she'd overstepped appropriate limits. Kasia, how has your life changed since I left for Europe? I work more hours now to help with house expenses. Coffee shop in morning, restaurant at night. David said family finances are tight and I need to contribute more. What family finances? David said your medical bills and recovery trip were very expensive and that everyone needs to sacrifice to help family through difficult time. I felt stunned by David's manipulation. My medical insurance had covered the stroke treatment completely, and my European recovery trip had been paid for with my own savings. There were no financial pressures on our household that would require Kasia to work multiple jobs. Kasia, has David been giving you money from your jobs to help with household expenses? Yes, I give him most of my paychecks to help with mortgage and utilities. David said this is how American families work together during crisis. I realized that David had been essentially stealing Kasia's wages while forcing her to live in the garage, using fabricated financial stress to justify exploitation that would have been illegal if she'd been an employee rather than family. David appeared in the kitchen around 8 a.m., looking like someone who'd been sleeping comfortably in a master bedroom while his wife slept on concrete. He kissed my cheek and sat down with the casual confidence of someone who assumed yesterday's conversation had been resolved in his favor. Mom, I'm glad you're feeling better. The Europe trip obviously did wonders for your recovery. Thank you, David. I had a lot of time to think about family relationships and what people deserve based on their actions. That's great. I think being away probably gave you good perspective on how well Kasia and I managed everything while you were recovering. Actually, I'd like to understand exactly how you managed things. Kasia tells me she's been working 2 jobs to help with family finances. David's expression shifted slightly, apparently recognizing that I was asking specific questions rather than making casual conversation. Well, you know how expensive everything has become. Medical costs, household maintenance, general living expenses. It made sense for everyone to contribute more during this difficult period. What medical costs? My insurance covered the stroke treatment, and I paid for my own recovery trip. There were lots of additional expenses you probably don't remember because of the stroke effects. Extra medications, special equipment, increased utilities from home care. I realized David was lying smoothly and confidently, apparently having prepared explanations for financial pressures that didn't actually exist. David, I'd like to see documentation of these medical expenses that required Kasia to work multiple jobs. Mom, I don't think you need to worry about financial details while you're still recovering. I've been handling everything responsibly. I'm recovered enough to manage my own household finances, David, and I'm curious about why managing those finances required making Kasia sleep in the garage. That wasn't about finances. That was about establishing appropriate boundaries for household harmony. Whose harmony? Because Kasia sleeping on concrete doesn't seem harmonious to me. David's casual confidence was beginning to crack as he realized I wasn't accepting his explanations without question. Mom, I think you're getting upset about normal household adjustments that happen when family dynamics change. David, what I'm getting upset about is discovering that you've been exploiting Kasia's labor while forcing her to live in conditions that would violate housing laws if she were a tenant rather than family. I haven't been exploiting anyone. I've been managing a difficult situation while you were away recovering from serious illness. By taking your wife's wages and making her sleep in the garage, by establishing structure and responsibility that helps everyone contribute appropriately to family welfare. I looked at my son, noting how easily he rationalized cruelty as family management and exploitation as shared responsibility. David had taken advantage of my absence and Kasia's vulnerable position to create a household dynamic that served his comfort while degrading her basic dignity. David, I think you and I need to have a private conversation about your understanding of family responsibility and property ownership. What do you mean? I mean that you seem to have forgotten some important facts about whose house this is and what rights that gives you to make decisions about how people live here. For the first time since I'd arrived home, David looked uncertain about his position in our family hierarchy. Some sons, I was about to remind him, made assumptions about inheritance and authority that needed immediate correction, and some mothers had spent 3 months in Europe, not just recovering from strokes, but planning responses to disrespectful behavior that required decisive action. I asked Kasia to take the day off from both her jobs, explaining that we had important family business to discuss. She looked nervous about missing work, clearly conditioned by months of David's financial pressure to believe that her income was essential for household survival. Victoria, I cannot afford to miss shifts. David said we are behind on mortgage payments and... Kasia, trust me on this. Today is more important than your shifts, and there are no mortgage payment problems. After she reluctantly called her employers, I suggested we take a drive while David went to his office job. I wanted to have a private conversation with Kasia away from David's influence, and I had specific places I wanted to show her. Where are we going? She asked as we got into my car. I want to show you something that will help you understand our family situation more clearly. I drove first to Riverside Apartments, a well-maintained complex about 10 minutes from my house. Kasia looked confused as I parked in front of the management office. Victoria, why are we here? Because I want you to meet Maria Santos, the property manager. Maria, this is Kasia, my daughter-in-law I've told you about. Mrs. Sterling, how wonderful to meet you, Kasia. Your mother-in-law owns this entire complex. She's been our landlord for 8 years. I watched Kasia's expression shift from confusion to surprise as she processed this information. Victoria, you own these apartments? I own several properties, Kasia. This is one of them. We spent 20 minutes touring the complex while Maria explained the rental income, maintenance schedules, and tenant satisfaction rates. Kasia listened quietly, clearly trying to understand why I was sharing this information with her. Our next stop was Meadowbrook Shopping Center, where I owned 3 commercial buildings that housed various retail businesses. Then, we visited Pine Ridge Estates, where I owned 6 rental houses that provided steady monthly income. Victoria, I do not understand. David said your medical bills created financial problems for family. David lied to you, Kasia. I have no medical debt, no mortgage payments, and substantial monthly income from my properties. There has never been any financial pressure that would require you to work multiple jobs or live in my garage. I could see Kasia processing this revelation, understanding that her months of hardship had been unnecessary manipulation rather than genuine family crisis. Why would David lie about money problems? Because it gave him excuse to control your time, take your wages, and make you feel like burden rather than valued family member. But Victoria, if you have all these properties and income, why does David not know? David knows about some of my assets. He knows I own our house and have retirement savings, but he doesn't know about most of my business interests because I've never discussed my full financial situation with him. We stopped for lunch at a quiet cafe, where Kasia finally felt comfortable asking direct questions about our family dynamics. Victoria, David said that after your stroke, I became too familiar with household management and needed to remember my place as foreigner in American family. Kasia, what's your place in our family? I do not know anymore. David says I am guest who should be grateful for permission to live in your house, but when you were sick, you treated me like daughter. I felt angry all over again, thinking about how David had undermined Kasia's confidence and sense of belonging during my absence. Kasia, when I was recovering from my stroke, what did you do for me? I helped with medications, physical therapy exercises, cooking, cleaning, driving to appointments. I slept in guest room in case you needed help during night. And how did that care make you feel? Like I was helping someone I love, like I was useful and needed, like I belonged in family. That's exactly how you should have felt, because that's exactly what you were doing. But David said I was taking advantage of your weakness to gain position in household that I had not earned. David was wrong. Kasia, you earned your position in this family by demonstrating love, loyalty, and sacrifice when I needed care most. What you haven't earned is sleeping in garage and working multiple jobs to support a household that doesn't need your financial contribution. Over lunch, I explained more about my property investments and business background, helping Kasia understand that our family's financial situation was stable enough to support comfortable lives for everyone without requiring sacrifice from the most vulnerable member. Victoria, what does this mean for my marriage with David? That depends on what you want it to mean. But Kasia, I want you to know that regardless of what happens with David, you have secure place in this family and financial support to build whatever life will make you happy. I do not understand. I'm saying that your future doesn't depend on David's approval or treatment of you. You have options that you didn't know existed. On the drive home, Kasia was quiet for several minutes before asking the question I'd been expecting. Victoria, why are you showing me all this? Why now? Because I spent 3 months in Europe thinking about family loyalty, and I realized that the person who showed me the most genuine care during my most vulnerable time shouldn't be living in my garage while my son enjoys comfort he hasn't earned. What are you planning to do? I'm planning to make some changes in household management and property ownership that will ensure people are treated according to how they treat others. Will David be angry about changes? David will be furious, but David's anger is less important to me than your well-being and dignity. Victoria, I do not want to cause problems in your relationship with your son. Kasia, David caused problems in my relationship with my son when he decided to treat you poorly while living in my house and spending my money. I'm just correcting those problems. That evening, I had David meet me in my home office, where I kept files on all my properties and investments. It was time for my son to understand exactly what he stood to lose through his treatment of Kasia. David, we need to discuss some changes I'm making to household arrangements and financial management. What kind of changes? The kind that will teach you about consequences for treating people poorly when you have no independent power to enforce that treatment. Some sons needed dramatic lessons about authority, respect, and the difference between inheriting wealth and earning it. David was about to discover which category he belonged to. David sat across from my desk with the casual confidence of someone who assumed he understood the parameters of our conversation. He'd spent months treating Kasia poorly while living in my house, apparently believing that his position as my son gave him authority to establish whatever household hierarchy he preferred. Mom, I know you're upset about the garage situation, but I think you're overreacting. Kasia has been perfectly comfortable with the arrangement. David, how would you know if Kasia was comfortable? Did you ask her opinion before moving her out of the guest room? I made an executive decision about household management while you were away. Someone had to maintain order and structure. Whose order? Whose structure? And based on what authority? David's expression suggested he thought these questions were unnecessarily philosophical. Based on the authority of being head of household while you were recovering in Europe. I opened the file cabinet next to my desk and pulled out the folder containing property deeds, insurance policies, and financial documents that David had never seen before. David, what do you know about my assets? You own this house, you have some retirement savings, probably some life insurance, standard middle-class widow finances. What if I told you that my standard middle-class finances include ownership of multiple properties that generate substantial monthly income? I'd say that sounds like wishful thinking from someone whose stroke might have affected their judgment about money. I spread the property deeds across my desk, watching David's expression change as he recognized addresses throughout our county. Documentation showing ownership of apartment complexes, commercial buildings, and rental houses. David, I own 17 properties that generate over $40,000 per month in rental income. I have investment portfolios worth more than $800,000. I own this house outright, with no mortgage payments. David picked up the deeds, studying them with growing confusion and what might have been concern. Mom, why didn't I know about any of this? Because you never asked about my finances, and I saw no reason to discuss my business affairs with someone who was more interested in eventual inheritance than current family relationships. This is a lot more than I realized. David, this raises interesting questions about your treatment of Kasia over the past few months. What do you mean? I mean that you forced your wife to work multiple jobs and sleep in the garage based on fictional financial pressures. You stole her wages to address non-existent household debt. You manipulated her immigration status and family position to justify treatment that amounts to domestic abuse. David's face flushed as he realized that his elaborate justifications for exploiting Kasia were collapsing under the weight of actual financial facts. I wasn't abusing anyone. I was managing household resources during a difficult time. David, taking someone's wages under false pretenses is theft. Forcing someone to live in substandard conditions in their own home is psychological abuse. Using someone's vulnerable immigration status to control their behavior is exploitation. Mom, you're being dramatic. Kasia was fine with contributing more during family crisis. What family crisis? Point to any actual financial problem that required Kasia's sacrifice. David was quiet for several minutes, apparently searching for explanations that would justify his behavior now that the fictional financial foundation had been removed. Even if our finances are better than I realized, Kasia still needed to understand appropriate boundaries for her role in this family. What role is that, David? She's a foreign daughter-in-law who married into an American family. She needed to understand that certain privileges had to be earned rather than assumed. I felt cold anger settling in my chest as I realized that David's treatment of Kasia wasn't based on financial stress, but on ethnic prejudice and assumptions about hierarchy that had nothing to do with our actual family values. David, what privileges did Kasia assume that she hadn't earned? Living comfortably in our family home, having equal say in household decisions, expecting to be treated like she was born into this family instead of someone who married into it. Our family home? David, whose name is on this deed? David looked down at the property paperwork, apparently remembering that he lived in my house rather than his own. Your name, obviously, but as your son, as my son, you live here because I allow you to live here. You have no property rights, no authority over household management, and no legal standing to control how other family members are treated. But I'm your heir. Eventually, David, inheritance is a gift, not a right. And gifts can be revoked when recipients demonstrate that they don't deserve them. You wouldn't disinherit your own son. I might transfer assets to someone who's demonstrated actual care and loyalty rather than entitlement and cruelty. David was starting to look genuinely worried as he realized that his assumptions about guaranteed inheritance were being challenged by someone who had actual power to change her will. Mom, I think your stroke might be affecting your judgment about family relationships. Maybe we should discuss this with your doctor. My stroke recovery has actually clarified my judgment about family relationships. I spent 3 months thinking about who deserves support and who deserves consequences. And what did you decide? I decided that the person who cared for me during my most vulnerable time deserves security and respect. And the person who exploited that vulnerability for his own comfort deserves to learn about consequences. What kind of consequences? I walked to my filing cabinet and pulled out documents I'd prepared before traveling to Europe. Updated legal paperwork that reflected new thinking about family relationships and inheritance. The kind of consequences that will teach you about treating people with dignity regardless of their immigration status, employment situation, or position in family hierarchy. Mom, you're scaring me. What exactly are you planning to do? I'm planning to ensure that people are rewarded for their character rather than their accidents of birth. Some lessons about respect and gratitude require dramatic demonstrations of power and consequences. David was about to learn that his mother's stroke hadn't made her weak. It had made her determined to protect the people who'd shown her genuine care when she needed it most. And some sons discovered too late that inheritance was earned through character, not guaranteed through biology. The next morning, I called my attorney, Robert Chen, to discuss implementing the legal changes I'd been considering since my return from Europe. David had left for work still shaken by our conversation, apparently needing time to process the revelation that his mother's wealth was substantial and his inheritance wasn't guaranteed. Victoria, it's wonderful to hear from you. How was your recovery trip? Enlightening, Robert. I need to make some significant changes to my will and property arrangements. What kind of changes? I want to transfer ownership of 3 rental properties directly to Kasia, establish her as beneficiary of my investment accounts, and create legal documents that protect her residence rights regardless of what happens to my relationship with David. Victoria, these are major changes that would significantly reduce David's expected inheritance. Are you sure about this decision? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I explained the situation Robert would help me address. David's exploitation of Kasia during my absence, his theft of her wages under false pretenses, and his psychological abuse disguised as household management. Robert, I want Kasia to have independent financial security that David can't control or eliminate. She's proven her loyalty and character, while David has proven his willingness to abuse vulnerable people when he thinks no one is watching. Victoria, I have to ask, is this decision influenced by lingering effects from your stroke? Courts sometimes scrutinize dramatic changes in estate planning following medical events. My stroke clarified my thinking about family relationships rather than compromising it. I spent 3 months reflecting on who deserves support and who deserves consequences. This decision is based on 18 months of observing how different people treat vulnerable family members. We spent 2 hours drafting documents that would transfer significant assets to Kasia while establishing consequences for David's behavior that wouldn't be reversible through manipulation or legal challenges. That afternoon, I met with Kasia at the coffee shop where she worked morning shifts, wanting to explain the legal changes in a neutral environment where David couldn't overhear our conversation. Kasia, I need to tell you about some decisions I'm making regarding property ownership and family finances. Victoria, I hope you are not planning anything that will make David more angry with me. David's anger is his problem to manage. Kasia, I'm transferring ownership of 3 apartment buildings directly to you, along with management responsibilities and all rental income. I do not understand. You want to give me properties? I want to give you financial independence. The 3 buildings generate about $15,000 monthly in rental income. You'll have enough money to live comfortably without depending on David or working multiple jobs. Kasia stared at me with an expression that suggested she couldn't process what I was telling her. Victoria, this is too much. I cannot accept such expensive gifts. Kasia, this isn't charity. This is recognition for 18 months of loyal care, including 6 months when I was completely dependent on your help after my stroke. But David will be furious if you give his inheritance to me. David forfeited his right to family inheritance when he decided to abuse the person who'd shown our family the most genuine care. Victoria, I am afraid. What if David tries to make legal problems for me? What if he says I influenced you inappropriately? Robert is preparing documents that will protect you from any legal challenges David might attempt. Kasia, your immigration status will also be secured through these arrangements. You'll have independent property ownership that establishes your permanent residence rights. Over coffee, I explained the practical aspects of property management and rental income, helping Kasia understand that she was about to become a financially independent woman with substantial assets of her own. Victoria, why are you doing this? Such generosity to daughter-in-law is not normal. Normal daughter-in-laws don't sacrifice 18 months of their lives caring for stroke patients while working multiple jobs to support households that don't need their financial contribution. I did what any caring person would do. Exactly. And David did what selfish people do when they think no one is watching. Kasia, character matters more than blood relationships. That evening, I asked both David and Kasia to join me in the living room for a family meeting about household arrangements and future plans. David arrived looking nervous, apparently having spent the day worrying about our previous conversation. Kasia looked equally anxious, clearly expecting conflict that might affect her marriage and living situation. I've made some decisions about property ownership and family responsibilities that will affect everyone, I began. Mom, before you say anything, I want to apologize for how I handled things while you were away. Maybe I was too strict about household management. David, your apology is noted, but apologizing doesn't undo months of psychological abuse and financial exploitation. I wasn't psychologically abusive. I was establishing structure. David, you forced your wife to sleep in the garage while you slept in my bed. You stole her wages under false pretenses. You manipulated her immigration fears to control her behavior. That's textbook domestic abuse. Mom, you're exaggerating. Kasia, tell David about your living conditions for the past 2 months. Kasia looked uncomfortable being asked to testify about her own mistreatment, but she answered honestly. I slept on camping mattress in garage. I worked 2 jobs and gave paychecks to David for family expenses. I ate meals alone because David said I complained too much during dinner. David's face flushed as he heard Kasia's calm description of treatment he'd somehow convinced himself was reasonable household management. That makes it sound worse than it was. Kasia agreed to these arrangements. David, did Kasia have any choice about these arrangements? Could she have refused without facing consequences? She could have discussed alternatives, while living in my house under threat of homelessness if she didn't comply with your demands? David was quiet, apparently recognizing that his position was indefensible when described accurately. Mom, what exactly are you planning to do about this situation? I'm planning to ensure that Kasia has independent security that you can't control or eliminate, and I'm planning to teach you about consequences for abusing vulnerable people. What does that mean? I handed both of them copies of the legal documents Robert had prepared that afternoon. It means that Kasia now owns 3 apartment buildings that generate $15,000 monthly income. It means she has independent financial security and legal protection that doesn't depend on your approval or treatment of her. David stared at the documents with growing shock and anger. You gave her 3 buildings? That's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I transferred ownership to someone who earned it through character and loyalty. This is insane. She's been here less than 3 years. And in that time, she's shown more genuine care for this family than you've shown in 32 years. Some sons needed dramatic lessons about respect, gratitude, and the difference between inheriting wealth and earning it through character. David was about to discover that abusing vulnerable family members had consequences that couldn't be undone through apologies or promises to change. David stared at the property transfer documents for several minutes, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and what looked like panic as he calculated how much of his expected inheritance had just been given to his wife. Mom, you can't be serious. 3 apartment buildings? That's probably worth over $500,000. The buildings are worth $1.2 million, and they generate $180,000 annually in rental income. Kasia will be financially independent for the rest of her life. This is crazy. You're giving away my inheritance to punish me for minor household management issues? David, forcing someone to sleep in a garage while stealing their wages isn't minor household management. It's domestic abuse. Kasia sat quietly, holding her copies of the legal documents with an expression that suggested she still couldn't quite believe what was happening. Victoria, this is too much responsibility. I do not know how to manage apartment buildings. You'll learn, Kasia. I'll teach you about property management, tenant relations, and business operations. You're intelligent and responsible. You'll be excellent at this work. But David, Kasia began, looking at her husband with concern about how he was processing this dramatic change in their family dynamics. "David doesn't have any say in how I distribute my assets," I interrupted. "He's forgotten that inheritance is a privilege, not a right." David stood up and began pacing around the living room, his agitation becoming more obvious as he absorbed the reality of what I'd done. "Mom, this is obviously some kind of psychological reaction to your stroke. You're not thinking clearly about family relationships and legal decisions. My thinking is perfectly clear. David, I spent 3 months in Europe reflecting on family loyalty and character. The person who cared for me during my most vulnerable time deserves security and recognition. I cared for you too. I handled your medical appointments and insurance paperwork. You handled bureaucratic tasks while Kasia handled intimate daily care. You managed the crisis while she managed the recovery. That doesn't justify giving her half of my inheritance." "Your inheritance? David, what exactly have you done to earn inheritance beyond being born into this family?" David stopped pacing and looked at me with frustrated confusion, apparently never having considered that inheritance might require justification beyond biological relationship. "I'm your son. Sons inherit from their parents. That's how families work. Some families work that way. Other families reward loyalty, character, and demonstrated care rather than accidents of birth. Mom, you're setting a terrible precedent. What message does this send about family obligations and respect? It sends the message that people who abuse vulnerable family members lose the privileges they assumed they'd inherited automatically." Kasia finally spoke, her voice quiet but determined. "David, I think Victoria is right about consequences. You treated me very badly while she was away, and you used lies about money to justify that treatment. I wasn't treating you badly. I was establishing appropriate boundaries for our household. You made me sleep on concrete floor while you slept in your mother's bed. You took my wages while telling me we had no money. You isolated me from family activities while claiming I was problem. That's not how it happened." "That's exactly how it happened," I interjected. "David, I have documentation of Kasia's work schedules, her direct deposits, and your withdrawals from her account. I know exactly how much money you took under false pretenses." David's defensive anger was beginning to shift toward what looked like genuine fear as he realized that his mother had been gathering evidence about his behavior rather than just reacting emotionally to a single incident. "Mom, you've been investigating me? I've been documenting family financial arrangements to understand why Kasia was working multiple jobs despite our household having no financial pressures. And what did you find? I found that you stole approximately $8,000 from Kasia over 2 months while forcing her to live in conditions that would violate housing codes if she were a tenant rather than family. I didn't steal anything. That money went toward household expenses." "What household expenses? David, our utilities, property taxes, and maintenance costs are paid automatically from my business accounts. There were no household expenses that required Kasia's contribution." David sat back down, apparently realizing that his elaborate justifications were collapsing under factual scrutiny. "So what happens now? You've given Kasia half my inheritance, and I'm supposed to just accept that? David, you're supposed to learn from this experience and demonstrate changed behavior that might earn back some family trust and financial consideration." "What kind of changed behavior?" "The kind that treats Kasia as a valued family member rather than a foreign interloper who needs to earn her place through service and sacrifice. And if I change my behavior, you'll reverse these property transfers?" "I might consider additional inheritance provisions based on genuine character improvement. But Kasia's ownership of those 3 buildings is permanent, regardless of your future choices. This is blackmail. You're holding my inheritance hostage to control my marriage. I'm establishing consequences for domestic abuse while protecting someone who deserves security after demonstrating exceptional character." That evening, after David had left the house to think about things at his friend's apartment, Kasia and I had dinner together for the first time since my return from Europe. "Victoria, I am afraid about what this will do to my marriage. David is very angry. Kasia, what do you want your marriage to become? Do you want to continue living with someone who thinks you deserve garage sleeping and wage theft? I want marriage with respect and partnership. But I do not know if David can change his ideas about my place in family. David's ideas about your place in the family have been corrected through legal documentation. You're now an independent property owner with substantial income. David can't control your finances or living conditions anymore, but he can make life very difficult if he chooses to be angry and resentful. Kasia, you have options now. You can afford to live independently if David can't accept treating you as an equal partner. You're not trapped by immigration status or financial dependence anymore. As we discussed Kasia's new financial independence and property management responsibilities, I realized that the most important outcome wasn't punishing David. It was ensuring that Kasia understood her own value and had power to demand respectful treatment. Victoria, why did you risk your relationship with your son for me? Because some things are more important than blood relationships, Kasia. Character matters more than biology. And 18 months of watching how different people treat vulnerable family members taught me who deserves support and who deserves consequences. Some mothers discovered that their adult children needed expensive lessons about respect, empathy, and the difference between inheriting wealth and earning it through character. David was about to learn whether he was capable of genuine change or whether his sense of entitlement was more important to him than family relationships. 3 days passed without any word from David, though Kasia received several angry text messages demanding that she convince Mom to reverse this insanity before she destroys our family permanently. I spent those days teaching Kasia about property management, reviewing tenant agreements, explaining maintenance procedures, and introducing her to the contractors and service providers who kept the buildings running smoothly. Victoria, the rental income from these properties is more money than I have ever seen in my life, Kasia said, as we reviewed the monthly financial statements from her new apartment buildings. You'll learn to manage it responsibly, Kasia. Money is a tool for security and independence, not just luxury. I want you to understand that you never have to depend on anyone else's approval for your basic survival again. What if I make mistakes with business decisions? You'll learn from mistakes, like everyone does. But Kasia, I've watched you manage household finances, medical schedules, and multiple work responsibilities with perfect organization. You have excellent judgment about practical matters. On Thursday evening, David finally returned to the house, looking like someone who'd spent several days drinking and complaining to friends who'd probably encouraged his sense of victimhood rather than offering useful perspective. Mom, I've been thinking about this situation, and I want to propose a compromise. What kind of compromise? You reverse the property transfers to Kasia, and I'll agree to marriage counseling to address any issues in how I've been treating her. I looked at my son, noting how he'd framed his proposal as a negotiation between equals rather than an apology from someone who'd committed domestic abuse. David, what makes you think the property transfers are negotiable? Because they were made impulsively based on emotional reaction rather than rational consideration of family relationships and financial planning. My decision was based on 18 months of observing character and 3 months of careful consideration while recovering in Europe. That's the opposite of impulsive. Mom, you can't seriously intend to give a foreign daughter-in-law more inheritance than your own son. Kasia isn't foreign anymore, David. She's an American citizen who owns substantial property in this country. And she didn't inherit anything. She earned it through exceptional care and loyalty. David's use of foreign daughter-in-law revealed that his resentment was based partly on ethnic prejudice rather than just financial disappointment. I'm willing to work on treating Kasia better, but only if you're willing to be reasonable about family finances. David, you're still trying to negotiate consequences as if your apology makes Kasia's abuse disappear. That's not how accountability works. I never abused anyone. You forced someone to sleep in a garage while stealing their wages under false pretenses. In most jurisdictions, that would qualify as domestic abuse and theft. Kasia, who'd been listening quietly from the kitchen, joined our conversation with an expression of new confidence that I hadn't seen before her financial independence was established. David, I want to discuss our marriage and your expectations for changing behavior. Kasia, we can work through our problems if Mom stops interfering with financial manipulation. The properties Victoria gave me are not manipulation. They are recognition for 18 months of care I provided to family member who needed help. You provided care because you're my wife, and that's what wives do for family. Wives do not sleep in garages while husbands sleep in comfortable bedrooms, David. Wives do not work multiple jobs to pay fictional debts while husbands spend money on entertainment. David looked surprised by Kasia's direct confrontation, apparently having expected her to maintain the apologetic demeanor she'd developed during months of psychological abuse. Kasia, you're letting Mom turn you against me with promises of money and property. David, I am not against you, but I will not return to living like servant in garage while you treat me like burden rather than partner. I never said you were a burden. You said I was irritating and did not deserve comfortable bedroom. You said I complained too much and disrupted household harmony. You said I needed to learn my place as foreign wife in American family. David's face flushed as Kasia repeated his own words back to him with the clarity of someone who was no longer afraid of consequences for speaking truth. I may have been too harsh during a stressful time, but that doesn't justify Mom giving away my inheritance. David, the inheritance was never guaranteed to be yours, I interjected. You assumed you would inherit my assets, but you never asked what you needed to do to earn that inheritance. Sons shouldn't have to earn inheritance from their mothers. Why not? What makes biological relationship more important than demonstrated character? Because that's how families work. Children inherit from parents based on love and blood relationship, not performance evaluations. I realized that David fundamentally misunderstood inheritance as automatic entitlement rather than recognition of character and family contribution. David, love doesn't mean ignoring abuse. Blood relationship doesn't excuse cruelty. And inheritance should reflect who deserves support based on their actions, not their accidents of birth. So you're saying I have to earn back my own inheritance by proving I deserve it? I'm saying that inheritance is a gift that should go to people who've demonstrated they'll use it responsibly and treat others with dignity. And you think Kasia has demonstrated that better than I have? I think Kasia spent 18 months proving her loyalty, sacrifice, and character, while you spent 3 months proving your willingness to abuse vulnerable people when you thought no one was watching. David was quiet for several minutes, apparently processing the reality that his assumptions about automatic inheritance had been permanently corrected through legal documentation he couldn't challenge. What exactly do I need to do to prove I've changed? You need to treat Kasia as an equal partner rather than a subordinate employee. You need to contribute to household management rather than expecting her to handle all domestic labor. You need to respect her property ownership and business responsibilities rather than trying to control her financial decisions. And if I do those things, you'll consider restoring my inheritance? I'll consider additional inheritance provisions based on sustained behavioral change over time. But David, Kasia's property ownership isn't conditional on your behavior. That's permanent regardless of your future choices. Some sons needed to learn that family relationships were based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical control, and that inheritance was earned through character rather than guaranteed through biology. David was about to discover whether he was capable of genuine change, or whether his sense of entitlement was more important to him than family relationships built on love and respect. 2 weeks later, I watched David attempt what appeared to be genuine behavioral change, while Kasia settled into her new role as property owner with remarkable competence. The transformation in household dynamics was striking. Kasia moved back into the guest bedroom, resumed eating meals with the family, and began managing her apartment buildings with the confidence of someone who understood she had real power and independence. Victoria, the tenant in Building 2, has complained about heating problems, Kasia reported during our daily property management meeting. I scheduled repair appointment with heating contractor for tomorrow morning. Excellent decision. How did you handle the tenant's frustration about the delayed response? I apologized for inconvenience and offered to reduce next month's rent by $50 for disruption. The tenant was very happy with this resolution. I felt proud watching Kasia develop business instincts that balanced tenant satisfaction with financial responsibility. She approached property management with the same careful attention she'd given to my stroke recovery care. David, meanwhile, was making visible efforts to participate in household responsibilities and treat Kasia with respect, though his behavior carried the artificial quality of someone performing reformed character rather than genuinely changing his worldview. Kasia, I picked up groceries on my way home from work, David announced, bringing shopping bags into the kitchen with obvious expectation of recognition for his contribution. Thank you, David. That is very helpful. I also cleaned the bathroom upstairs and started laundry. I figure since you're busy with property management, I should handle more household tasks. I noticed that David's helpful behavior was consistently announced and performed with audience awareness, suggesting that he was demonstrating reform rather than naturally adopting more equitable partnership patterns. David, how are you feeling about the changes in our household dynamics? I asked during dinner one evening. I'm adjusting to the new arrangement. Obviously, it's been challenging to accept that decisions were made without consulting me, but I'm trying to be supportive of Kasia's business responsibilities. What's been most challenging about the adjustment? David paused, apparently considering how much honesty he wanted to share about his ongoing resentment. I guess I'm struggling with feeling like I've been replaced as the primary family member. Kasia now has more financial resources and property ownership than I do, which changes traditional marriage dynamics. What traditional marriage dynamics? The expectation that husbands provide financial leadership while wives handle domestic responsibilities. Now Kasia has independent wealth while I'm still working a regular job and living in my mother's house. I realized that David's discomfort was based not just on losing expected inheritance, but on feeling emasculated by his wife's newfound financial independence. David, does Kasia's financial success threaten your sense of masculine identity? It's complicated. I was raised to believe that successful men provide for their families and that financial dependency flows from wives to husbands, not the other direction. And now you feel like Kasia's success makes you less successful? I feel like the natural order of our marriage has been reversed in ways that make traditional relationship roles confusing. Kasia, who'd been listening to this conversation with growing understanding, joined the discussion with new assertiveness. David, why do you think financial success should follow traditional gender roles rather than character and effort? Because that's how stable marriages and families typically function. Men provide financial security while women provide domestic support. But David, that model only works if men actually provide financial security. You were taking my wages while forcing me to live in garage. That is not providing security. I was managing household resources during difficult time. You were stealing my money while lying about family finances, Kasia interrupted with firmness I hadn't heard from her before. That is not leadership or provision. That is exploitation. David's face reddened as he was confronted with accurate descriptions of his behavior from someone he could no longer intimidate or control. I made mistakes during a stressful period, but I'm trying to change and be a better husband. David, what does being a better husband look like to you? I asked. Supporting Kasia's business success, sharing household responsibilities, and treating her as an equal partner rather than expecting her to handle everything domestically. Those sound like appropriate goals. How confident are you about sustaining those changes? David was quiet for several minutes, apparently struggling with honest self-assessment about his capacity for permanent behavioral change. I'm confident about wanting to change. I'm less confident about whether I can permanently adjust to marriage dynamics where my wife has more financial power than I do. I appreciated David's honesty about his insecurities, even though his concerns revealed attitudes about gender and power that needed further examination. David, what would help you feel more comfortable with Kasia's financial independence? Honestly, knowing that I still have meaningful role in our family and that my mother still values our relationship despite my mistakes. Your role in the family is what you make it through your choices and behavior. And my valuation of our relationship depends on your character development, not your gender anxieties. Over the following week, I observed David's continued efforts to demonstrate reformed behavior, while Kasia grew increasingly confident in her property management role. The contrast was striking. David was performing change, while Kasia was naturally growing into new power and responsibility. Victoria, I want to ask you something personal, Kasia said during one of our property inspections. Do you think David's behavioral changes are genuine? Or is he just trying to convince you to restore his inheritance? What do you think, Kasia? I think David is trying to be a better husband, but that his motivation is still mostly about financial consequences rather than understanding why his behavior was wrong. And how does that make you feel about your marriage? I feel grateful to have options now. If David cannot genuinely change his attitudes about my place in family, I can afford to live independently and build life that respects my dignity. Is that what you want? Independence from David? I want marriage with mutual respect and partnership, but I will not return to accepting treatment that makes me feel like servant or burden. I realized that the most important outcome of transferring property to Kasia wasn't punishing David. It was giving her power to demand respectful treatment and leave if that respect couldn't be sustained. Kasia, regardless of what happens with David, you have family support and financial security. You're not trapped by immigration concerns or economic dependence anymore. I know, Victoria. And that knowledge makes me feel strong enough to insist on marriage that honors my dignity rather than accepting whatever treatment David chooses to give me. Some gifts were more than financial transfers. They were grants of power that allowed vulnerable people to demand the respect they deserved and leave situations that didn't provide it. Kasia was learning to use her newfound independence to negotiate better treatment rather than simply accepting abuse because she had no alternatives. 6 months after the property transfers, I was reviewing quarterly rental income reports with Kasia when David requested a family meeting to discuss long-term arrangements and relationship expectations. His behavior during the past months had been consistently respectful, though it still carried the calculated quality of someone managing impression rather than experiencing genuine transformation. Victoria, I think we need to discuss where our family relationships stand and what my future looks like, David said as we gathered in the living room that had become the site of so many difficult conversations. What specifically do you want to discuss? I want to know if my 6 months of improved behavior have earned any consideration for restoring part of my inheritance, and I want to understand what Kasia and I need to do to rebuild our marriage on sustainable terms. I noticed that David was still framing the conversation around what he could earn back, rather than expressing genuine understanding of why his behavior had been unacceptable. David, what have you learned about marriage and family relationships during these past 6 months? I've learned that treating family members poorly has serious consequences, and that wives deserve respect and partnership rather than subordinate roles. And what have you learned about yourself? David paused, apparently considering how much self-awareness he wanted to reveal. I've learned that I had unrealistic expectations about inheriting wealth without earning it, and that I used traditional gender roles to justify treating Kasia unfairly when she was in a vulnerable position. Those are important recognitions. David, do you believe your behavioral changes are permanent, or are you performing reformation to regain financial advantages? I think my changes started as performance, but they've become more genuine over time. Living with Kasia as an equal partner has been better for our marriage than the controlling dynamic I created before. Kasia, who had been listening carefully, joined the conversation with the confidence that had developed through 6 months of successful property management. David, I want to tell you how I experience our relationship now compared to before Victoria gave me independence. I'd like to hear that. Before, I felt like guest and family who had to earn right to stay through work and compliance. Now I feel like family member whose opinions matter and whose contributions are valued. And how do you feel about me specifically? I feel like you are trying to be better husband, but that you still see my financial independence as temporary situation rather than permanent change in our marriage dynamics. David's expression suggested that Kasia had identified something he'd been hoping wouldn't be noticed. What makes you think I see your independence as temporary? Because you ask Victoria about restoring your inheritance, as if the goal is returning to previous arrangement where you control family finances and I depend on your approval for security. I don't want to control you, Kasia. I just want to feel like I have meaningful role in our family's financial future. You can have meaningful role through your own career success and contributions. But David, you cannot have role that requires reducing my independence or property ownership. I felt proud listening to Kasia articulate boundaries that protected her newfound power, while offering David opportunities for partnership that didn't depend on her subordination. Kasia, what would sustainable marriage look like to you? I asked. Marriage where we both contribute according to our abilities, where financial decisions are made together but neither person can control other person's security, and where cultural differences are respected rather than used to justify unequal treatment. And David, what would sustainable marriage look like to you? Marriage where we're both contributing to family success, and where I feel like valued partner rather than someone whose role has been eliminated by mom's financial intervention. I realized that David was still struggling with feeling replaced rather than understanding that partnership meant both people having power and independence. David, why do you feel like your role has been eliminated rather than enhanced by having a financially successful wife? Because traditional marriage roles gave me clear identity as provider and leader. Now Kasia has more financial resources than I do, which makes my contribution feel less essential. What if your contribution was based on character and partnership rather than financial dominance? I'm trying to learn how that works, but it's challenging to adjust to marriage dynamics I wasn't prepared for. After David left for work, Kasia and I continued our conversation about family relationships and future planning. Victoria, I want to ask you about something important. David keeps asking about his inheritance, but I want to know about my responsibilities to this family. Ma, what do you mean? I mean that you have given me substantial wealth and opportunity. What do you expect from me in terms of family care and relationship maintenance? I realized that Kasia was thinking about reciprocal obligations rather than just accepting gifts without considering corresponding responsibilities. Kasia, what responsibilities do you think you have? I think I should contribute to your care as you age, support family relationships when possible, and use the wealth you've given me in ways that honor your values and generosity. Those sound like appropriate considerations. Kasia, what values do you want your wealth to reflect? Helping people who are vulnerable, supporting family members who demonstrate good character, and building security that doesn't depend on other people's approval or control. And how do you see your relationship with David developing? I hope David can genuinely accept marriage with financially independent wife, but I will not sacrifice my security or dignity to make him comfortable with traditional gender roles. What if David cannot adjust to your independence? Then I will end our marriage and build life that respects my worth and capabilities. Victoria, having options makes me able to insist on treatment I deserve rather than accepting whatever David chooses to give me. That evening, I made a decision about David's inheritance that reflected both his progress and his remaining limitations. David, I've decided to restore part of your inheritance based on your behavioral improvements over the past 6 months. Really? How much? I'm including you as beneficiary of 2 rental properties and $200,000 in investment accounts. However, Kasia remains the primary beneficiary of my estate, and her current property ownership is permanent. That's less than I expected, but more than I was afraid I might receive. David, your inheritance reflects your demonstrated character improvement, balanced against the seriousness of your previous behavior. Future inheritance considerations will depend on sustained, respectful treatment of family members. I understand, and I want you to know that I'm grateful for the opportunity to earn back family trust. Some sons needed expensive lessons about character, respect, and the difference between inheriting wealth and earning it through demonstrated values. David was learning that family relationships were based on mutual dignity rather than hierarchical control, and that marriage partnerships required both people having power and security rather than one person dominating the other. 2 years after that pivotal night, when I found Kasia sleeping in my garage, I sat in the conference room of my attorney's office, finalizing the last details of my comprehensive estate planning. The woman across from me was no longer the frightened, exhausted daughter-in-law who had been working multiple jobs to survive my son's psychological abuse. Kasia had transformed into a confident businesswoman who managed 7 properties, employed 3 maintenance staff members, and had become one of the most respected landlords in our county. Victoria, the tenants in Building 5 want to renew their leases for another 2 years, Kasia reported as we reviewed her quarterly business summary. I've built excellent relationships with all our renters, and we have 0 vacancy rate across all properties. That's exceptional management, Kasia. Your attention to tenant satisfaction has created the kind of stable rental income that most property owners dream about. I learned from watching how you treated people with respect and fairness. Good business comes from good character, just like you taught me. David, who now worked as Kasia's business partner while maintaining his regular job, had evolved into someone I barely recognized from the man who had justified forcing his wife to sleep on concrete floors. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy, but 18 months of consistent behavioral change had eventually produced what appeared to be genuine character development. Mom, the insurance renewal paperwork is complete for all 7 buildings, David said, presenting the organized documentation that reflected his new role in supporting rather than controlling family business operations. Kasia and I have also identified 2 additional properties that might be good investments if you're interested in expanding the portfolio. What kind of properties? A small apartment complex near the university that's been well maintained but underperforming due to poor management, Kasia explained. We think we could improve tenant satisfaction and rental income with better communication and responsive maintenance. I felt proud watching David and Kasia work together as genuine partners, with David contributing his organizational skills while respecting Kasia's authority as primary property owner and business leader. How are you 2 functioning as business partners? I asked. It's working well, Kasia replied. David handles paperwork and scheduling while I handle tenant relationships and major decisions. We consult each other about important choices, but David understands that final authority rests with property owner. And David, how do you feel about this arrangement? It's taken time to adjust to working for someone who used to be financially dependent on me, but I've learned that supporting Kasia's success benefits our entire family. Her business abilities are actually much better than mine. I realized that David had finally understood that partnership meant amplifying each other's strengths rather than competing for dominance or control. What have you learned about marriage during this transition? I asked them both. I've learned that respect has to be demonstrated through actions, not just promised through words, David said. And that financial independence makes Kasia a better partner because she chooses to be with me rather than feeling trapped by economic necessity. I've learned that having security and power allows me to love David without fear, Kasia added. When I was dependent on his approval for basic survival, I could not be honest about problems in our relationship. Now I can address issues directly because I have options if he cannot change. And how has this affected your relationship quality? We fight less and communicate better because neither of us feels powerless or resentful, David explained. When Kasia was sleeping in the garage, she was angry but couldn't express it safely. When I thought my inheritance was guaranteed, I was entitled but didn't realize it. Now, we're both choosing this relationship every day. That afternoon, I met privately with my attorney to finalize the will that reflected my family's transformation over the past 2 years. Victoria, your estate planning now reflects the character development you've witnessed in both David and Kasia, Robert observed as we reviewed the final documents. Exactly. Kasia receives the majority of my assets because she's demonstrated exceptional character, business competence, and genuine care for family well-being. David receives substantial inheritance because he's proven capable of personal growth and respectful partnership. And if David's behavioral improvements prove temporary, the trust structure protects Kasia's interests regardless of future changes in David's character. She maintains control of property management and business decisions even if David reverts to previous patterns. Victoria, this estate plan creates incentives for continued character development while protecting vulnerable family members from potential abuse. It's an elegant solution to complex family dynamics. That evening, I gathered David and Kasia for what I knew would be my final major family announcement about inheritance and property arrangements. I wanted to share my final estate planning decisions with both of you. They listened attentively as I explained how my assets would be distributed. Kasia inheriting the house and majority of business properties, David inheriting substantial but secondary assets, and both of them sharing responsibility for family legacy and community involvement. Mom, I want you to know that I'm grateful for the opportunity to earn back family trust and inheritance consideration, David said. The past 2 years have taught me that character matters more than entitlement. And Victoria, I want you to know that I will use the wealth you've given me to help other vulnerable people and to maintain the values you've taught me about treating everyone with dignity, Kasia added. What values have I taught you? That family is created through loyalty and care, not just biology. That wealth should be earned through character and used to protect people who need support. That respect has to be demonstrated consistently, not just promised during crisis. I looked at these two people, my son, who had learned expensive lessons about humility and respect, and my daughter-in-law, who had transformed from victim to confident leader, and realized that our family had been rebuilt on stronger foundations than it had ever possessed before. My son thought that sleeping in my bed while forcing his wife to sleep in my garage was appropriate household management. He discovered that some mothers reward loyalty over biology, that inheritance is earned through character rather than guaranteed through birth, and that abusing vulnerable family members has consequences that permanently change family relationships. But most importantly, he learned that treating people with dignity creates stronger families than controlling them through fear and dependency. At 76, I was no longer just a stroke survivor or a woman whose son had disappointed her. I was Victoria Sterling, family matriarch who had used wealth strategically to teach lessons about character, protect vulnerable people from abuse, and create incentives for respectful relationships that honored everyone's dignity and potential. Some lessons about love and respect required dramatic interventions that permanently altered family dynamics. But when those interventions produced genuine character development and healthier relationships, they became the foundation for family legacies built on justice rather than just biology. David and Kasia had learned that families function best when everyone has power, security, and options, and when love is demonstrated through actions that honor each person's inherent worth. The end.